on the morning of August 22nd, 1485, a day that changed the course of English history unfolded. At Bosworth Field, two armies faced off across mist-shrouded fields. On one side stood Richard III, the last king of the Plantagenet dynasty. On the other, the rising Henry Tudor. The clash was bloody, the battlefield filled with shouts, screams, and the clang of metal. Richard continued to fight until the very end, mounted on his horse. Historians recount that he declared, "Today, for my kingdom, either the crown or the coffin," and indeed, that is what happened. Richard fell to the ground among his enemies, sword in hand. England's last Plantagenet king had been killed. But the real mystery began after that. Because the body of the king who died on the battlefield that day vanished from history, as if it would never be seen again. Imagine a king. He has a throne, armies, power, and a crown. Yet after his death, even his tomb cannot be found. How is it possible that the body of such a great king could remain lost for centuries? And how is it possible that in modern times, it would be discovered beneath an ordinary parking lot? Today, I will tell you the story of a mystery that has remained unsolved for 500 years, the lost tomb of King Richard III. Richard III was the last representative of the Plantagenet dynasty. During his short reign, he was known as a powerful and ruthless leader. In Shakespeare's plays, he was immortalized as a hunchbacked, cruel, and ambitious tyrant. In reality, however, Richard was a king noted for his intelligence and political maneuvering. Yet, when he was defeated by Henry Tudor's army at the Battle of Bosworth, a new era began in English history. The Tudor dynasty came to power, and Richard lost both his throne and his life. After the battle, Richard's body was taken to the city of Leicester. According to chronicles, he was buried in the church of a Franciscan monastery known as Grey Friars. However, the manner of his burial was quite remarkable. A grand funeral ceremony would have been expected for a king. But Richard was buried almost hastily, without ceremony, quietly laid to rest. This situation overshadowed his memory and led to the creation of legends about him for centuries. The location of the grave was known at first. A monument had even been erected on top of it. But England was entering a period of great change. In the 16th century, King Henry VIII's famous closure of the monastery's decree destroyed religious institutions across the country. Greyfriars Church also suffered the consequences of this storm. The church and monastery were completely destroyed, and new buildings were constructed in their place. Thus, Richard's tomb also disappeared. During that period, Leicester's mayor purchased the land where the church stood and built a large mansion on it. According to legend, Richard's tomb was located right in the mansion's garden, and the mayor had erected a special stone to mark the king's resting place. However, over the centuries, this information was forgotten. The mansion was demolished, the gardens disappeared, and the streets changed. Then, in 1611, historian John Speed put forward a new claim about Richard's grave. According to Speed, when the church was destroyed, the angry crowd had removed Richard's body from his grave and buried it under Bow Bridge. Some even said his bones had been thrown into the river. There was no concrete evidence for this story. Nevertheless, people believed this legend, because the church had disappeared and no one knew where the grave was. Thus, Speed's story was accepted as true. By the 1800s, the belief that Richard was buried under Bow Bridge had become so widespread that a commemorative plaque was erected beside the bridge. At one point, it was even thought that a skeleton recovered from the river belonged to Richard. However, this too was incorrect. For centuries, the people of England could not find their king's grave. Richard's name lived on in Shakespeare's pages as a hunchbacked and ruthless tyrant. His true face, his real body, and his actual grave remained hidden behind the mist. However, at the end of the 20th century, some historians decided to pursue this mystery. In particular, a group called the Richard III Society wanted to protect the king's reputation and find his real grave. Archives were examined, maps were compared, and it turned out that John Speed had actually made a big mistake. He had searched for the Grey Friars in Leicester in the wrong place. On his map, he had marked the Black Friars instead of the Grey Friars. Because he had marked the wrong church, he was unable to find the tomb and instead invented a fictional story about a bridge. When this error came to light, all the clues were reevaluated. When the true location of Grey Friars was determined, a surprising result emerged. Today, this area lies entirely beneath the center of modern Leicester. Municipal buildings, houses, and most significantly, an ordinary parking lot had been built over the king's tomb. In 2005, when researcher Philippa Langley arrived in Leicester, she pulled into that parking lot. A large letter R had been painted in white on the asphalt. It simply meant reserved parking. But for Langley, this sign meant much more. A powerful feeling arose within her. It was as if Richard was calling her, and so began the journey to find a king who had been lost for 500 years. On a hot summer morning in 2012, a group of archaeologists and volunteers from the University of Leicester gathered in an ordinary parking lot in the city center. To an outside observer, the scene was unremarkable: construction machinery, shovels, and a dusty ground. But beneath this soil, a secret that had been hidden for 5 centuries might lie. Philippa Langley would describe the excitement of that morning years later. I was standing there, and my heart was pounding. This wasn't just an excavation. Perhaps one of the greatest mysteries in English history was about to be solved. But was there really a king buried beneath this ordinary parking lot? Or would it all end in disappointment? For centuries, historians had been mistaken about Richard's tomb. Now, would modern science, archaeology, and one determined woman's passion change the course of history? Things were not easy before the excavation began. The project, carried out in collaboration between the Richard III Society and the University of Leicester, was struggling financially. Many people were skeptical about the initiative, mocking it with comments like, "Are they looking for a king in a parking lot?" But Langley's determination impressed everyone. Old maps, municipal archives, and geophysical measurements were used to locate Grey Friars Church in the heart of Leicester. Historical documents showed that the church was located directly beneath the car park. Now it was time to dig. The excavation team decided to dig pits at 3 different locations. Everyone's eyes were on the machine's buckets, their ears tuned to the sound of the earth. In the early days, the only finds were modern waste, pieces of old stone walls, and a few pottery shards. Many people were disappointed, but on the 3rd day, the moment arrived. One of the shovels uncovered a layer of soil on the ground that was a different color. This was a sign that could indicate human burials. The archaeologists immediately stopped the machines and began digging by hand. On the 3rd day of the excavation, human bones began to appear from beneath the soil. First the foot bones, then the legs, then the torso, and finally, the skull slowly emerged from the earth. At that moment, everyone held their breath. But there was something even more surprising. The skeleton's spine was distinctly curved. For centuries, historians had talked about Richard III being hunchbacked. Even Shakespeare had mocked his deformed body. Now, the skeleton before them matched these accounts perfectly. The archaeologists continued to work carefully. The skeleton was removed without haste, and without damaging even the smallest pieces. It was clear at first glance that death had been violent. There were cuts on the skull resembling blows from a sword or axe. In addition, traces of wounds that could have been sustained in battle were found on various parts of the body. The curvature of the spine was a condition known in modern medicine as scoliosis. This proved that Richard did not have a hunchback, but that there was a visible curvature in his back. This detail alone shed light on the misinterpretations of history. However, there was a problem. Hundreds of burials had taken place in Leicester city centre over the centuries. So who could guarantee that these remains truly belonged to Richard? The answer lay hidden within the bones themselves. Archaeologists and scientists decided to transport these remains to the laboratory and employ the most advanced techniques available. Philippa Langley, however, could not hide her emotions. At that moment, I knew what I had felt for years was true. A voice inside me said, "We've found it." But feelings alone were not enough for the scientific community. DNA testing, carbon dating, and forensic science would now come into play. When the skeleton excavated from the site was brought to the University of Leicester's laboratory, everyone had the same question in mind. Was this really King Richard III? Or was history just playing a little trick on us? Scientists began examining the bones, using the most modern technologies. First, carbon dating tests were performed. The results indicated that the skeleton dated back to the late 15th century. This time frame perfectly coincided with the year of Richard III's death, 1485. But this wasn't enough, because other people who died during the same period could also have been buried in Leicester. Therefore, much more definitive evidence was needed: DNA. Scientists knew they would not be able to find Richard's direct male descendants, because the House of York had ended at Bosworth. However, descendants through his mother Cecily Neville's female line were still alive. This meant that mitochondrial DNA, the genetic trace passed down through the female line, could reveal Richard's identity. Research has determined that a carpenter named Michael Ibsen, who lives in Canada, is the 16th generation descendant of Richard's sister, Anne of York. Another female relative, Wendy Doldig, also comes from the same lineage. DNA samples taken from Michael Ibsen were compared with DNA extracted from the bones. The work took months because it was very difficult to obtain viable DNA from 500-year-old remains. But when the results came in, the world press reported the news. The skeleton's DNA matched Michael Ibsen's DNA at a rate of 99.999%. The same match was confirmed with Wendy Doldig. There was no longer any doubt. The skeleton found under the car park in Leicester belonged to Richard III, one of England's most controversial kings. This discovery was not merely an archaeological find. It was also a turning point that shook history books. Richard III, portrayed in Shakespeare's plays as evil, hunchbacked, and demonic, now stood before us once more in the silent testimony of a skeleton. The scoliosis in his spine showed that he was not hunchbacked, but had a serious curvature in his back. The wounds on his skull indicated that he was a king who had died on the battlefield. And all of this revealed the truth behind the rumors that had circulated for 500 years. In 2015, a grand ceremony was held at Leicester Cathedral for Richard III. Members of the royal family, clergy, historians, and the public gathered together. The coffin was paraded through the city streets on a horse-drawn carriage. Thousands of people lined the roads. A king forgotten for 5 centuries was finally being reburied, with respect. The special tombstone prepared at Leicester Cathedral still attracts crowds of visitors today. The story of Richard III is not merely the tale of a king's discovery. It is also a lesson in how history is written and how it can be misunderstood. The dark image created by Shakespeare's pen remained in the minds of humanity for centuries. But the silent bones beneath the earth finally revealed the truth. There is a question that is still debated today. Was Richard III truly a cruel tyrant, or was he a victim of history? Perhaps we will never know the answer. But one thing we do know, even 500 years later, his story still captivates and intrigues us.